I just wanna go, get completely drunk, forget about tennis.
Do you feel like you are the world #1 player at the moment? And if not, what do you feel like you need to do to get back to that status?
This question, guys. I mean, let's just look at the rankings. So by now,
the wildly popular 3-day mixed doubles tournament. And guess who is right at the centre of it all in the New York hype? Our very own Alex Eala.
If Nike thought it had found the perfect face for the 2026 US Open dress, but according to the rumor, Aryna Sabalenka was anything but thrilled when Alex Eala became the center of attention. What exactly sparked the alleged tension? And did a simple tennis outfit suddenly turn into a full-blown rivalry? As fans dissect every detail, one question remains. Is this really about fashion or something much bigger?
Quite at her absolute best. I think she's a real contender, and we have to mention our friend Alex Eala as well, because she's going to be in New York and it's going to be a different experience, I feel, for her. This is going to be an interesting test. While she's had all this kind of attention around her so far, now she's going to be on Ash, she's going to be on big stages, everyone's going to look at her as a contender. Is this something a little bit different for her, that she's not quite had this? She's a superstar in the Philippines, but she's going to go beyond that, I think, at this US Open.
Aryna Sabalenka is the world #1, one of the most dominant players in women's tennis, and a Grand Slam champion who has spent years making opponents regret scheduling decisions. So when Nike rolled out one of its major 2026 US Open looks, and the face attached to the campaign was not Sabalenka, the tennis world suddenly found itself staring at a marketing decision that was impossible to ignore.
All of the people who watched today, the crowd was amazing. So I think everything in general just made the atmosphere so exciting, but at the same time so tense. So that's also part of why I'm so happy. Yeah.
So many young Filipinos and young Asian women around the globe look up to you. What message do you have for them?
I would say that anything is possible, and to dream big. I think me as a person, I'm very ambitious, and although there was no one from my country who did this before or was successful in tennis, I took inspiration.
Instead, the blue Nike Court Slam dress was prominently modeled by Alex Eala, the 21-year-old Filipino star whose rise has been turning more than a few heads across the tennis world. And that is where this story gets interesting, because there is an important difference between what actually happened and the version that social media immediately tried to turn into a 5-season Netflix drama.
Been on social media this week, the internet is absolutely buzzing. From Sam Querrey calling her potentially the biggest star in tennis right now, to Andy Roddick breaking down her signature serve tactics on his podcast, Eala Mania has taken total control of the WTA conversation. Even Nike dropped their exclusive US Open kits, and Alex's royal blue outfit sold out instantly.
Sabalenka did not publicly declare war on Alex Eala. She did not storm into Nike headquarters wearing tennis shoes and demand to know who approved the campaign. However, Sabalenka had already made something very clear earlier in 2026 when she revealed that she wanted more creative freedom from Nike.
Well, I think she'll sell out like she did in Toronto. I mean, how impressive was her result in Washington, the way she played? She was incredible. And then to bounce back and win 2 matches against her, she won 7 in a row and then lost in Toronto. She loses to Anisimova in 3 sets, who last year made 2 major finals. So she's on the cusp. She's the first Filipina to make the 4th round of a major. I wouldn't be surprised if she's in the quarters or semis. She's that good. I think the mentality is second to none. I look between the ears. Having coached and worked on tour in the men's and the women's, the most important greeting, because everybody can play, but it's a swagger, it's the belief, it's in between the ears, it's the intensity. She goes tick, 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 tick in all boxes.
After watching Naomi Osaka arrive at the Australian Open with a spectacular and highly personal fashion statement, Sabalenka openly admitted that she wished Nike would give her a similar opportunity to express herself through her own presentation. She explained that her approach would probably be different, imagining something more elegant and dramatic, perhaps involving a long coat and an entrance that felt closer to a red carpet appearance than a traditional walk onto a tennis court. In other words, the world number one had already sent Nike a polite but very noticeable message that she wanted to have a little more two athletes and a much larger question hanging over the entire situation. If Sabalenka was the world number one, then why was Alex Eala becoming one of the faces most closely associated with Nike's newest tennis push? That question is where the real story begins, because rankings and marketing do not always operate according to the same scoreboard. Tennis can be wonderfully cruel in that respect, since the court relies on a system that keeps track of points, victories, tournament results, and every painful afternoon when a player ranked outside the top 50 suddenly decides to produce the greatest performance of her entire life. Alex Eala has become increasingly difficult to ignore in that conversation. Nike has had a relationship with Eala since she was a teenager, which means that this was not a company waking up one morning and randomly deciding to discover a tennis player simply because the internet needed some fresh content.
I think just to be ambitious and to dream big and know that you can do it. Yeah. Well, I off the court, I would say that I'm getting recognized quite a bit more. And I don't know, I think that's kind of really it. I would say in my day-to-day, there's not a lot that's changed because the work ethic that I've had has been the same for years. You know, I work hard every day, do the best I can. You know, I have a great team around me.
The relationship had been developing for years, and by the time the 2026 US Open approached, Eala was no longer simply a promising young player from the Philippines. She had become one of the most recognizable emerging figures in Asian tennis, with a rapidly growing international following and a fan base that pays extremely close attention to everything she does. That growing audience becomes particularly important when examining Nike's decision to use Eala in the presentation of the Nike Court Slam dress in Old Royal and White. The product presentation made it clear who was wearing the outfit, and Alexandra Eala became closely associated with the look as Nike introduced the collection. The dress itself featured basketball-inspired mesh detailing and formed part of Nike's elite tennis collection. But the presentation became far more interesting because of the athlete chosen to wear it. Eala was not simply standing beside a product because she was helping introduce that product to a global audience. And somewhere in the distance, the tennis internet immediately began sharpening its magnifying glasses. To be fair to Sabalenka, the situation is not as simple as claiming that Nike ignores her, because that would be completely inaccurate. She remains one of the biggest names in women's tennis and has a major relationship with the company, but her own comments earlier in the year demonstrated that even a world number one can look at another athlete's creative freedom and think that she would like a little of that freedom for herself. The fascinating part is that Sabalenka's original comments were connected to Naomi Osaka's dramatic Australian Open fashion moment, rather than to Alex Eala or the US Open campaign.
Such a game changer for Alex and her tour peers. Professional tennis is notoriously expensive, with travel, coaching staff, and logistics. A guaranteed payout of $140,000 just for round one gives young players the financial foundation to reinvest directly into their teams, hire a top-tier physio, and build a long-term career setup. The USTA is also rolling out a dedicated $2 million player support and welfare fund, showing how player compensation is evolving across the sport. And the big money isn't limited to the main singles draw. Starting Tuesday, August the 25th, Alex is jumping right into the thrilling mixed doubles competition.
Sabalenka was not publicly attacking Eala, and there was no evidence that she had complained that Nike preferred Eala. However, once Nike later placed Eala at the center of a prominent US Open product presentation, Sabalenka's earlier comments suddenly acquired an entirely different context in the eyes of fans. That is also where the internet tends to become particularly creative, because someone can make a relatively innocent comment in January, and by August, social media has connected that comment to a blue tennis dress and constructed a conspiracy board that looks as though it belongs in a detective series. The discussion was no longer simply about whether Sabalenka liked her own outfit, because it had evolved into a larger question about whether Nike was quietly revealing where it saw its next major marketing opportunity. Eala's journey has also provided exactly the kind of narrative that major sports companies tend to appreciate. She developed through the Rafael Nadal Academy, carried the expectations of an entire nation, and gradually transformed from a promising junior player into a serious presence on the professional tour. Every major step in her journey has attracted more attention. Every breakthrough has created additional interest, and every appearance has reinforced the possibility that Eala could eventually become one of the most commercially significant tennis players of her generation. Therefore, Nike's decision to feature her prominently in connection with the 2026 US Open dress did not necessarily mean that Sabalenka had been pushed aside. It could simply indicate that Nike recognized an opportunity to place Eala at the center of a product launch that could reach an audience growing at an extraordinary rate.
I think it's really interesting, especially when you look at players obviously like Serena or Naomi, who really embrace fashion and express themselves with it. And we had the young Filipino star. You know, you could see even in such a young star how interested she is in fashion and how she wants to learn about it and follow it. And I think it's great. It's wonderful how sports and fashion have become this wonderful.
Of course, that explanation is probably far too reasonable for social media, where people were far more interested in imagining Sabalenka standing in front of a giant Nike logo and asking how the world #1 had somehow ended up losing a fashion contest to a player ranked outside the very top of the rankings. The irony is that this entire situation may actually reveal something much bigger about modern tennis. The traditional idea that the highest-ranked player automatically receives the largest marketing spotlight has become increasingly complicated because commercial power does not always move in perfect harmony with the rankings. A player can be #1 in the world and still have a smaller social footprint than another athlete ranked much lower, while a player can also lose early in a tournament and continue generating millions of views because fans remain invested in her personality, story, style, or cultural significance. The scoreboard determines who wins the tennis match, but the audience ultimately determines who wins attention. And companies such as Nike operate in a business where attention has enormous value. That reality does not make Sabalenka less valuable because she remains one of the most accomplished and dominant players in the sport. Instead, it creates a fascinating contrast between two different forms of power. Sabalenka represents the established standard of elite performance, with the trophies, the ranking, the extraordinary power, and an intimidating ability to strike a tennis ball as though it had personally offended her.
You're the highest ranked Filipino in WTA history. When did you first have the feeling when you were playing in like a full stadium that you're like, wow, I'm kind of famous?
I didn't want to believe it at first. This past year, when I play in the big tournaments, the Filipinos will show up for me. It's just an amazing thing to have. This year, everything just elevated even more. Like Australia, my court. I saw some videos afterwards. It was just crazy. It was madness. We've hit spots that have just been super Filipino packed around the world. And so I went home to Manila. Melbourne's full of Filipinos. The Middle East is super full of Filipinos.
Eala, on the other hand, represents possibility, a new market, a new generation of fans, and the excitement that emerges when a country with millions of passionate sports supporters sees one of its own climbing through the ranks of professional tennis. When those two forces are placed beside each other, a simple tennis dress suddenly becomes part of a much larger conversation about how the sport chooses to market its stars. The question becomes whether the biggest spotlight should always belong to the player who has already conquered the mountain, or whether it can also belong to the player who is still climbing while bringing an enormous audience along for the journey. Nike's answer, at least in this particular campaign, appeared to suggest that there was room for both approaches. Nevertheless, that did not stop fans from comparing the reactions to the athletes' respective looks, especially after Sabalenka's apparel generated criticism and discussion among some fans, while Eala's Old Royal Nike Court Slam dress attracted significant attention as part of the upcoming US Open presentation. Once those two conversations collided, the contrast became impossible to ignore because one athlete was the world #1 who had already expressed a desire for greater creative freedom, while the other was a rising star prominently associated with one of Nike's newest product presentations.
We get more US Open kits, and dare I say, I don't mind Alex Eala's Nike dress. I think Aryna Sabalenka definitely got the worst dress. Also Naomi Osaka, I wasn't a big fan of this dress either. But Nike just released this dress for Alex Eala. So Alex wears this royal blue dress, and on the sides it has this mesh lining. And having the fishnet on the side, I am okay with this. She also has some mesh lining on the back of the dress. Overall, I like this color a lot. And whereas on the other pieces, I think we have way too much mesh and fishnet on these items.
That does not necessarily create a feud, but it certainly creates the kind of contrast that encourages people to start asking questions. The biggest question may be what Nike sees in Alex Eala, and the most obvious answer is potential. Potential, however, can be a dangerous word because it can mean almost anything. But in Eala's case, the potential is not limited to what she might achieve through victories and rankings. It also involves what could happen when her tennis success meets the enormous audience that is already following her journey. If Eala continues climbing the rankings, reaches the later stages of Grand Slam tournaments, and develops into a consistent threat against the sport's biggest names, Nike's long-term investment could eventually begin looking extremely clever. It is not difficult to imagine a situation several years from now in which Eala becomes a genuine Grand Slam contender while remaining one of the most recognizable athletes in the Philippines. If that happens, every campaign that once appeared ambitious may eventually look less like a gamble and more like preparation for what that is, where Sabalenka's situation becomes even more interesting, because she does not need anyone to gamble on her talent. The evidence of her ability is already sitting in the trophy cabinet, while what she appears to want is the freedom to turn her personality into something larger and more distinctive than the standard athlete presentation.
Nike really did their big one with the Alex Eala for the US Open kit. Mesh is currently undergoing a huge comeback. Our fierce queen is absolutely going to slay at the US Open, so I can't wait to see her rock this on court. People love to hate on what's different, but I genuinely think that in 10, 20 years time, this is going to be a super valuable collector's item. And in the current form that Alex is in right now, playing out of her mind, I don't see why she can't make a deep run, nay, potentially even win the US Open.
Sabalenka appears interested in becoming a more active participant in the storytelling surrounding her own image. She wants the entrance, the fashion, the personality, and perhaps a little theatrical chaos. Although her version of theatrical chaos would apparently arrive with a considerably more elegant wardrobe. That desire could ultimately benefit her because the more Sabalenka leans into her personality away from the baseline, the more powerful her overall brand could become. Her tennis already communicates with tremendous force, and there are moments when her game sounds less like a sporting performance and more like a thunderstorm arriving without permission. The next question is whether her fashion identity can eventually become just as distinctive as her game. That may be one of the most entertaining aspects of this entire Nike situation, because Alex Eala modeling the US Open dress does not have to mean that somebody else is losing. What it does reveal, however, is that Nike appears to be thinking about much more than rankings. Rather than representing a simple feud, this entire situation may therefore be developing into something far more interesting. A competition for attention without an actual competition between the athletes themselves. The perceived rivalry has largely been created by marketing decisions, fan comparisons, and the unstoppable human instinct to turn two successful women wearing different outfits into the center of an international sporting drama.
Did Nike just give Alex Eala the best US Open kit? Because after seeing Sinner, Alcaraz, and Sabalenka's looks, I really think they did. So this is her look reveal, and Nike absolutely cooked with this one. I love this royal blue, the black and white trims, and the mesh panels give off this cool retro basketball-inspired look. And after becoming the first Filipina to win a WTA title, she's now heading into New York with arguably the best Nike kit of the tournament. What do we think here? Is this the best US Open?
As the US Open unfolds, the real answer will not come from a single product page or one Instagram post, because it will emerge from what happens next. The biggest questions will be whether Eala can transform her growing commercial momentum into even greater success on the court, whether Sabalenka can continue dominating the sport while developing the creative identity she has expressed an interest in exploring, and whether Nike will eventually give the world number one the dramatic, elegant, and completely unforgettable entrance she appears to want. One thing is already clear, however, because Alex Eala's association with that dress has done far more than simply promote a piece of tennis apparel. It has exposed a changing reality within modern tennis, where being number one in the rankings remains the ultimate competitive achievement, but attention has developed into its own separate scoreboard. The while Eala is building an audience and a commercial presence that could become increasingly powerful as her career develops. In the end, winning the tennis match and winning the spotlight have become two completely different competitions. The court decides one competition through rankings, trophies, and results, while the audience decides the other through attention, engagement, cultural connection, and the ability to make millions of people care about what happens next. Judging by the amount of attention generated around one blue dress, Alex Eala's role in that second competition may only be getting started.